Today we're going to look at creating some statistical graphs. The first one I want to look at is called a stem and leaf diagram. We begin by drawing a vertical line. Since these look like test scores, we're going to represent them in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, etc. And we use the first digits. So this represents all the scores in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. Whether you go from largest to smallest or smallest to largest, it doesn't matter. I usually start at the largest and go to the smallest. Students like to know if they've done well. So here we have our 95 and our 94. In the stem and leaf diagram, the 90 part would be represented as the stem and the 5 as one of the leaves. 95. Then we'd have 94. We see both of the test scores for 95 and 94. Now we do the same thing for the 80s. Got a lot of those. There's 8 of those. So it appears that 89 is the largest. And then we have a score of 88. We have 3 scores of 87, 2 scores of 86, and an 80. The 70s. A 76 and a 75, a 68, a 69, and a 67, and finally we have a 50. This represents the 16 scores on this test. So this is an example of a stem and leaf diagram. A circle graph or a pie chart, we can represent the data by first drawing a circle. Since we have 16 pieces of data, we're going to cut our circle into 16 parts. We have 1/2. Now we cut it into quarters. Cut each of those quarters in half. That gives us 8ths. And now we cut each of those 8ths in half and we get 16 pieces of our pie. So beginning with the 90s, we have 2 out of 16, or 1/8 of the circle will be shaded. 1/8 of the 360 degrees. Or 2/16. So the blue area represents all the scores in the 90s. Now we do the 80s. 2, 4, 6, 8 of those. 8 out of 16 is 1/2 of the circle. So 1/2 of 360 degrees will be shaded for the 80s. We shade 1/2 of the circle for the 80s. Because my painting here isn't doing really well. But hopefully you got the idea. 1/2 of the circle represents the scores in the 80s. See if we can fix up our circle a little bit here, cleaning it up. And then we go to the 70s. There's 2 of those, so that's 2 out of 16, or 1/8 of the circle, similar to the blue pie shaped. So this takes care of those scores in the 70s. We have 3 scores in the 69s, so 3/16 will be representing that. And last, those scores in the 50s. That's the way you make a pie diagram. And maybe yours is colored in a little better. A histogram, again we're going to use our frequency table and draw a horizontal line to represent the scores. a vertical line to represent the frequencies. And now we want to create bars, but we need to determine the class marks. The class marks, when thinking of scores, are pretty easy to determine. It would make sense that they would be the middle of the 90s, the middle of the 80s, 85, the middle of the 70s, the middle of the 60s, and the middle of the 50s. And maybe you'd have more. If you remember, we had one all the way up to 8. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8 frequencies. 2, 4, 6, 8. We will create the bars to represent the 2 scores in the 90s. And then we have the bar that represents the 8 scores in the 80s. The 2 scores in the 70s. The 3 scores in the 60s, and the 1 score in the 50s, constructing a histogram. Remember, in a histogram, the bars need to touch each other. A polygon graph is done in the same manner. We have the vertical line for the frequencies, the horizontal line for us to represent the scores. This is the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. 2, 4, 6, 8. The frequencies. We place a dot at the 90s at 2, because that represents all the scores in the 90s. The number of scores in the 80s is 8. The number of scores in the 70s is 2. The number of scores in the 60s is 3. It's a little bit higher, but not 4. And the number in the 50s is 1. And then we connect the dots. A polygon frequency chart. So these are 4 ways we can look at data using a statistical graph.